Harold didn't think of himself as old. Sure, his hair had turned silver and his pace had slowed a bit, but he still walked his dog every morning and trimmed his own hedges. So when Dr. Kim asked him to try something simple during a routine checkup, Harold didn't expect his life to shift. "Can you sit down on the floor and stand back up without using your hands or knees?" she asked kindly. Harold chuckled. "Why, you trying to embarrass me?" Dr. Kim didn't smile. "Humor me." So he tried and failed. That moment wasn't just awkward, it was terrifying. What Harold didn't realize was that his inability to perform that single movement put him at a significantly higher risk of death in the next 5 years. Not because of the movement itself, but because of what it revealed about his balance, muscle strength, flexibility, and brain-body connection. Later that night, Harold couldn't sleep. He kept thinking, is this how it starts? A small moment, and then everything changes? And he was right. Chapter 1. Harold's Wake-Up Call. Harold never thought a quiet Thursday morning would change the way he saw his future. He was 67, retired just 2 years ago from a long career as an electrical engineer in Michigan. His days were calm, comfortable, a gentle rhythm of morning dog walks, crossword puzzles over black coffee, and tending to his modest vegetable garden out back. He wasn't a gym person, never had been, but he figured his daily strolls and occasional yard work were enough to keep things ticking. Harold's doctor, Dr. Melton, was the cautious type. Their annual checkups were usually routine. Blood pressure, cholesterol, the usual reminders to eat more greens and cut back on red meat. But this year, something changed. "I want you to try something a little different today," Dr. Melton said, rolling his stool toward Harold. "It's a simple test, but it tells me a lot." Harold, curious, nodded. "All right, shoot." The doctor gestured to a padded mat in the corner of the room. "I want you to sit down on the floor, then stand back up. Try not to use your hands, knees, or any support if possible." Harold chuckled. "That's it? Just get up off the floor?" Dr. Melton smiled. "That's it." Simple, right? Harold lowered himself carefully, letting out a grunt as his knee creaked under the shift in weight. Sitting wasn't too hard. Getting up was another story. He rocked forward, instinctively reached out for the side of the exam table, and pushed himself up with both hands. "Woo, I haven't done that in a while," Harold admitted. Dr. Melton didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Harold, I need you to listen closely. A growing body of research, real, peer-reviewed science, is telling us something surprising. Seniors over 65 who cannot perform this movement without assistance are at a 500% higher risk of dying within 5 years. Harold blinked. "Wait, what?" 5 times more likely, Dr. Melton repeated. "Not because the movement itself is magic, but because it reflects so many vital systems. Balance, core strength, muscle coordination, neurological function. If you can't stand up without help, it's your body sending a signal that something important is fading." The room went quiet. Harold felt the weight of those words press into his chest like a slow, invisible force. He looked down at his hands, still resting on the edge of the table. "I thought I was doing all right," he said softly. "I mean, I don't feel sick." "You're not," Dr. Melton said gently. "But you're losing something. Quietly, gradually. This test just caught it before something bigger does." That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, eyes open, thinking about his grandchildren, about whether he'd still be able to walk them to the park in a few years, about the moment he fell last winter trying to change a light bulb, and how he'd brushed it off as nothing. He remembered the slow way his father declined in his 70s, how it was never a dramatic fall, but a steady shrinking of abilities, until even getting dressed felt like a chore. "No," Harold whispered in the dark, "not me. Not like that." He sat up, pulled the comforter aside, and lowered himself to the floor. This time, there was no doctor watching, just Harold in the stillness of his room, testing himself against time. And once again, he needed both hands to rise. But now he understood what it meant. He wasn't just failing a movement, he was getting a warning. And that made all the difference. Chapter 2. The Silent Signals We Ignore. 3 days after Harold's appointment, he was sitting on his porch, watching the sunrise paint soft amber across the sky. His black Labrador, Maggie, lay curled by his feet. But instead of his usual peaceful morning, Harold's mind was busy. He couldn't stop replaying the moment he struggled to stand from the floor. It was such a small thing, yet the weight of its meaning lingered like a fog. He began to remember all the little things he'd brushed off in recent months. The time he sat cross-legged to fix the sink trap and needed the counter for balance afterward, the occasional wobble when stepping off a curb, the slight hesitation before reaching for something on the top shelf, the preference for chairs with arms, though he never really thought why. These weren't accidents. They were quiet clues, small ripples in his independence that had gone unnoticed, not because they weren't there, but because Harold, like most older adults, had gotten used to adjusting. That's how decline happens, not through dramatic falls, but slow, silent adaptation. Harold remembered how his mother, Eleanor, had once been a lively woman. She used to dance in the kitchen while baking. But by the time she was in her late 70s, she stopped kneeling to garden. She used a grabber for everything. She said it was just easier. But Harold now wondered if it was something more. How many of her changes were adaptations to weakness she never talked about? He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He wasn't alone in this. Leonard, his old neighbor 2 doors down, had once loved fixing up vintage motorcycles. Then, one day he stopped, said his hands weren't what they used to be. But it wasn't arthritis. It was fatigue, weakness, a slow fading of ability that no one noticed until he fell getting out of the tub and never fully walked again. Harold felt a mix of frustration and fear. Why didn't anyone talk about this? Why wasn't this test, the simple floor-to-stand movement, part of every senior checkup? Why was it that something so critical could hide in plain sight? But now that he knew, he couldn't ignore it. He reached for the notebook he'd left on the porch table. On the first page, he wrote in bold letters, "I will rise." Then, underneath it, he listed 3 goals. Stand from the floor without using hands. Regain confidence in movement. Stay strong enough to live fully. As Harold stared at the words, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go back to ignoring the signs. From this moment forward, every movement mattered. So, he started small. That morning, instead of taking the shortcut through the park, Harold walked the long way. Instead of watching TV after lunch, he stretched. Instead of avoiding the floor, he practiced sitting down and getting up. With help, but on purpose. It was clumsy, it was tiring, but it was also liberating. Each small struggle was no longer a failure, it was a step toward reclaiming something precious. His strength, his independence, his future. Chapter 3. The Floor Beneath Our Fears. By the end of the first week, Harold had made the floor part of his routine. Not because he liked it, but because he feared it. There was something unsettling about sitting on the floor as a man in his late 60s. Not because it was painful, but because it reminded him of how fragile everything had quietly become. The ground, once a place where his children crawled into his arms, now felt like an enemy. A place he might not rise from. That thought lingered. So each morning, after feeding Maggie and brewing a pot of black coffee, Harold would roll out a mat on the living room floor, and every day he would lower himself down, slowly, awkwardly, and attempt to stand back up. At first, he used the armrest of the couch. Then, just one hand. Then, only his knee. On day 6, he rose without support for the first time. His breath caught. Not from exertion, but from emotion. He had done it. Just 1 week earlier, his doctor had told him what it meant if he couldn't do it. The fear had clung to his ribs like damp air. But now, the floor felt different, less like danger, more like a test he was learning how to pass. Still, it wasn't just about the movement. What surprised Harold the most was how his mind began to change. Each time he challenged himself physically, stood a little taller, wobbled a little less, he felt something else shift. Not just muscle, not just balance, but memory, sharpness, even his sleep improved. It was as if his body had been waiting for a signal that it still mattered. One morning, while standing up from the floor, he remembered something his father had once said. "You'll know you're still alive when your body still listens to your will." Harold whispered it under his breath and smiled, but something deeper stirred too. Because as he continued the practice, he began to notice other things that had nothing to do with knees or strength. He started spotting the same elderly man sitting alone at the park bench during his morning walk. So he started saying hello. He found himself whistling again, just softly, while pouring his cereal. He called his daughter Jen without needing a reason. The small things that had quietly faded. The joy of presence, the rhythm of breath, the glow of ordinary life began to return. All because of a movement. Not a machine, not a pill, just the decision to meet the floor again and again and again, until it wasn't a threat. It was a reminder that every single day we rise, or we retreat. And Harold, he had decided to rise. Chapter 4, Invisible Warnings We Ignore. It wasn't until the 7th time Harold rose from the floor that he noticed something strange. Not in his body, he was slowly growing stronger, but in his behavior. He had started avoiding things, tiny things, like tying his shoes while standing, like picking up the newspaper from the doormat, like bending over to grab Maggie's leash. These weren't conscious decisions. They were quiet, automatic changes. He realized he'd begun adapting, not because he was incapable, but because he was afraid of failing. And he wasn't alone. His neighbor Jim, once a retired firefighter with arms like tree trunks, now shuffled slowly from porch to mailbox, gripping the railing even when the steps were dry. He laughed it off as just being careful, but Harold saw it for what it was, caution disguising fear. It struck him hard. We don't suddenly lose our independence after 65. We give it away in tiny pieces, one adjustment, one compromise, one skipped step at a time. That night, Harold sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the floor. He remembered how, months ago, he'd stopped sitting down to play blocks with his grandson. He'd blamed his knees, but really, he hadn't trusted himself to get up. No one had noticed, not even him, until now. That was the most frightening part. Not that the body changed, but that we often didn't notice until it was too late. The next morning, Harold made a list. A quiet inventory of his invisible avoidances. No more tying shoes on a chair. No more skipping the bottom shelf at the grocery store. No more watching life from standing height alone. If his body was whispering warnings, he would start listening now. Because the greatest danger wasn't falling. It was silently surrendering before the fall ever happened. Chapter 5, The 4-Minute Promise. Harold never imagined his second chance would begin on an ordinary Tuesday, barefoot on the living room carpet, with a kitchen timer in his hand. 4 minutes. That's what the therapist told him. "Just give me 4 minutes a day," she said, smiling gently. "And I'll give you something better in return. Confidence, balance, and maybe even more years to live." Harold laughed then. 4 minutes? That was nothing. But on day 1, it felt like everything. Minute 1, chair squats 10 times, no hands. He wobbled on the 4th, nearly fell on the 7th, and the 10th, that one came with a grunt and a whisper. "You're still here. Don't give up." Minute 2, 1 leg, balance. He stood near the wall, afraid to lift his foot. When he finally did, his hand hovered over the counter like a parachute cord. But he didn't fall. And that was enough. Minute 3, down to the floor, then up again. This one felt personal, like he was wrestling gravity itself. He used a cushion, then a hand, but on day 3, he used less. By day 7, he was lowering with control. Minute 4, seated knee lifts. Simple, but exhausting. Not physically, but emotionally. He hadn't realized how much he'd ignored his legs, his breath, his heartbeat. These tiny movements reminded him he was still alive, still capable, still fighting. And somewhere, between the creaks of old joints and the rhythm of breath, something beautiful happened. Hope returned. Not in a thunderous way, but like dawn, soft, steady, impossible to ignore. By day 14, Harold didn't need the timer anymore. By day 21, he could stand from the floor, no hands, no knees, no fear. But it wasn't just about movement. It was about everything that came with it. Maggie's leash in his hand again, the toy blocks on the carpet, the laughter of his grandson, louder than ever, because Harold was down there with him. The 4-minute promise had kept its word. It gave him back a future he thought he'd already spent. Chapter 6. The Doctor Who Never Checked. When Harold walked into his physician's office 3 months later, everything looked the same: the pale green walls, the framed diplomas, the soft tapping of keyboard keys behind the reception desk. But Harold had changed. He carried himself taller, he moved without hesitation, he smiled like a man who had reclaimed something sacred. His doctor, Dr. Reeves, glanced at the chart. Weight stable? Blood pressure's good? No complaints? Harold hesitated. No, but I have a request. Dr. Reeves looked up. I want you to watch me get off the floor, Harold said. There was silence, confusion. I'm serious, Harold continued. I read about something called the sitting-rising test. I want to show you. Dr. Reeves chuckled lightly. Harold, we check your heart, your lungs, your labs. And you've never asked me if I can rise off the ground without help, Harold interrupted gently. But when I couldn't do it, I learned it meant something important. Reluctantly, the doctor nodded. Okay then. Harold moved to the corner of the room. He knelt, then sat cross-legged. Then, slowly, steadily, without his hands, he stood. The room was quiet. Dr. Reeves blinked, then looked at Harold differently. You're right, he said finally. We don't check this, but maybe we should. That moment wasn't just for Harold, it was for every patient who sat in that chair before him, and everyone who would after. A moment when something shifted, not just in a man's body, but in the system that was supposed to protect him. Harold didn't need a medal, he just needed to be seen, fully, functionally, humanly. That day he left the clinic without a prescription, but he'd given one to his doctor. To the world. Start paying attention to what really matters before it's too late. Chapter 7. The 21-Day Redemption. Gerald was 78 when he admitted to himself, I've stopped trying. He hadn't always been that way. A retired high school principal, he had led with discipline, presence, and pride. But since his wife passed, movement became something he avoided, until one quiet fall morning when he tried to get up from the floor and couldn't. No one was home. His cup of tea spilled beside him. The silence was suffocating. When help finally came, he didn't tell anyone how afraid he'd been. Not of the fall, but of the truth. He had become invisible, even to himself. That night, he found a video about a test that could predict if he'd still be alive in 5 years. The words were honest, the tone was gentle, the message was terrifyingly clear. He watched the entire thing, and instead of turning off the screen, he whispered, "Not yet. I'm not done yet." The next morning he started. 4 minutes a day, that's all it asked. Chair squats, balance, controlled breathing, floor rises. The first week was humiliating, the second was hard, the third was different. On day 21, Gerald stood from the floor without his hands for the first time in years. No applause, no audience. But his eyes filled with tears, because he knew what it meant. He had turned back the clock, not on age, but on defeat. His strength wasn't just in his legs, it was in his will. Conclusion. A message from the floor to the future. If you've come this far, you now understand something few people ever realize. Longevity doesn't live in a bottle of pills. It doesn't hide in the numbers of your blood work. It's not just about your age. It's in your ability to move, to rise, to reclaim the ground beneath your feet. It's in you. So I'll leave you with this simple invitation. Sit down, slowly, then stand back up, without your hands, if you can. If you struggle, don't be afraid. You are not broken. You are beginning. Because the moment you say, "I want to try," is the moment you extend your life, not just in years, but in meaning. We'll be here to guide you, every step, every chapter, every rise. If this video moved you or helped you, leave us a comment below. Share it with someone you care about. Because sometimes the most powerful lifeline is a story told at the right time. Take care of yourself and remember, we'll see you again in the next video. You're never too old to rise again.